Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into a seriously fascinating and, frankly, completely messy limbo period in American history. You know that weird window between the actual start of the Revolutionary War and the signing of the Declaration of Independence? Because believe it or not, jumping from colonial protest to a full-blown Declaration of Independence, yeah, that was absolutely not a sure thing. So let's get right into it.
Okay, let's throw ourselves right into the action. Picture this. It's April 1775. We're at Lexington and Concord. Massachusetts militiamen are actively trading fire with British regulars. This is the exact moment Ralph Waldo Emerson famously dubbed the shot heard round the world. But here's the really wild part. The bullets were flying. Blood was literally being spilled on the ground. But the political argument? It wasn't even close to being settled.
And that brings us to this massive historical paradox. I mean, think about it. How do you fight a bloody, grueling war against a king you're still secretly hoping is going to swoop in and be your savior? For over a year, colonial forces are laying siege to Boston, there's active combat, and yet most colonial delegates are insisting, no, we aren't fighting for independence. They still saw themselves as loyal subjects, just trying to get their rights back within the British Empire. They're shooting at the king's army while simultaneously crossing their fingers that the king will step in and rescue them.
You can really see how the options for peace were just vanishing at breakneck speed. Back in late 1774, the First Continental Congress was basically just an emergency meetup to coordinate a trade boycott. Pretty standard protest stuff. But jump to May 1775, right after the violence at Lexington and Concord, and the Second Continental Congress convenes under a completely different, way more intense atmosphere. The window for any sort of peaceful resolution is just slamming shut.
So the group left trying to manage this escalating nightmare is the Continental Congress. And they had essentially become a rebellion government entirely by default. They didn't plan a rebellion, and honestly, a lot of them weren't even sure they wanted one. But here they are, acting as a de facto government. They're raising a Continental Army, they're printing paper money, those Continental dollars, they're doing all the things a national government does. Except they have absolutely zero formal power to levy taxes, which, as you can guess, is a structural weakness that almost dooms their war effort later on.
The sheer contradiction of what they're doing in the summer of 1775 is honestly almost comical. In one breath, Congress is officially appointing George Washington to command a brand new Continental Army for all-out warfare, right? But then, in the exact same month, they draft the Olive Branch Petition and send it to King George III, practically begging him for reconciliation. It's like, we are preparing to destroy your army, but please, let's just be friends again.
Well, the breaking point finally hits when King George III essentially slams the door right in their faces. He actually refuses to even read their petition. I mean, talk about terrible customer service. Instead, he officially declares the colonies to be in open rebellion. And then, to really add insult to injury, he hires roughly 30,000 Hessian mercenaries, paid German soldiers, to go over and crush the colonists. For the Americans, the writing was on the wall. The king wasn't some misguided father figure getting bad advice from Parliament. No, he was an active, hostile aggressor.
And right into this incredibly tense, super uncertain atmosphere steps Thomas Paine. In January 1776, this English-born radical, who, by the way, had only lived in America since 1774, drops a 47-page pamphlet called Common Sense. Because he didn't have this ingrained generational loyalty to the crown, he could attack the monarchy with a bluntness that American-born writers were just too scared to use. And let me tell you, he completely rewired the entire political debate overnight.
500,000. That staggering number is the high-end estimate for how many copies of Common Sense sold in just its first year. To really wrap your head around that, you have to remember the entire colonial population at the time was only about 2.5 million people. This was a literal viral sensation before going viral was even a thing. It was being read out loud in taverns, debated in coffee houses, reprinted in newspapers from New Hampshire all the way down to South Carolina, and passed around constantly in the Continental Army camps.
What Paine did was pull off this brilliant strategic pivot. For a whole decade, the colonists had aimed all their anger directly at Parliament and its unfair laws. Paine changed the target entirely. He shifted the blame completely off Parliament and pointed the finger right at the king. He called the very concept of hereditary rule an absolute joke, arguing that picking a leader based on birth is as crazy as saying someone has to be a doctor just because their dad was one. He looked at the revered British Constitution and just called it a total sham.
He was also just a master communicator. Paine intentionally used everyday, plain English to connect with regular folks, completely ditching the dense, Latin-heavy legal jargon of the time. He has this famous line where he says, "We may as well assert that because a child has thrived upon milk, that it is never to have meat." He's tackling the argument that America needs Britain just because it prospered under British rule in the past. Paine is basically saying, look, clinging to the mother country is literally childish. It's time for America to grow up.
He also uses this really evocative metaphor about a young oak tree. He writes that any fracture right now would be like carving a name into a young sapling with a pin. As the tree grows, the wound just gets bigger and deeper. He's emphasizing the massive urgency of this situation. He's telling them, if you patch together a shaky compromise with Britain right now, you are just setting up future generations for a massive, systemic failure. You need a clean break now.
But the most crucial takeaway is that common sense wasn't just a giant rant against the king. Paine laid out a really compelling, positive vision for what could come next. Independence wasn't just about breaking away. It was this unprecedented, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to build something entirely new. They could prove to the rest of the world that free, Republican institutions actually worked. They could build a government based entirely on popular sovereignty, the actual will of the people, instead of the completely outdated idea of hereditary privilege.
So you combine King George permanently slamming the diplomatic doors shut with Thomas Paine completely rewriting the ideological playbook, and public opinion experiences a massive shift. By June 1776, a majority in the Continental Congress is finally ready to make a move. Richard Henry Lee of Virginia steps up to the plate and officially introduces a resolution to declare the colonies free and independent states.
From there, Congress taps a committee of 5, which includes absolute heavyweights like John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, to draft a formal declaration. But as we know, it was Thomas Jefferson who really did the heavy lifting here. In just 17 days, Jefferson takes a lot of the standard colonial petition rhetoric, mixes in his own genius, and produces an absolute masterpiece. John Adams later called it an expression of the American mind.
The preamble to that declaration is wild, because it doesn't just say, hey, we're leaving. It meticulously lays out a step-by-step Enlightenment philosophy. Step 1. All men have unalienable rights: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Step 2. Governments only exist to protect those specific rights, and they only get their power from the consent of the governed. That's a huge nod to John Locke's social contract theory. And Step 3. If a government starts destroying those rights, well, the people have the absolute right to alter or abolish it. Boom! That right there is the ultimate theoretical justification for their entire revolution. And following that soaring philosophical preamble, the document just goes on the attack. It lists exactly 27 specific rapid-fire charges directly against King George III. Things like, he has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns. Notice that target again? It's the king, not Parliament. Because to actually sever ties and achieve true independence, they had to legally and emotionally break their final allegiance to the crown itself.
Now, why does this matter so much for the rest of world history? Well, the Declaration of Independence didn't just announce some local, isolated political breakup. It unleashed this breathtakingly ambitious, universal claim. It essentially declared that these fundamental rights didn't just belong to English colonists in North America, but to all people everywhere. And within just a single generation, those exact concepts would cross oceans and borders, directly inspiring revolutions in France, in Haiti, and all across Latin America.
However, to really understand this history, we have to look closely at the glaring, deliberate contradiction sitting right at the heart of this document. On one hand, you have this beautiful, soaring rhetoric proclaiming that all men are created equal, but on the other hand, the most prominent men signing this document actively owned enslaved human beings. In fact, Thomas Jefferson actually included a strong condemnation of the slave trade in his original draft, but the Continental Congress deliberately struck it out before finally adopting the text on July 4, 1776. So, I'll leave you with this final, highly provocative thought. How does a brand new nation build its entire foundation on the self-evident truth of equality while simultaneously maintaining the brutal institution of human enslavement? The short answer is it couldn't. This immense, undeniable gap between the soaring ideals of the Declaration and the very real, tragic reality of American life wouldn't just fade away. It became the central, defining tension of the United States for the next 2 centuries, challenging generation after generation to force the nation to finally live up to the true meaning of its creed. Thanks for exploring this massive ideological shift with me. Keep questioning and keep learning.